all of our missile production is very limited, and we have done nothing to fundamentally change that. And this is not a new problem, and that's part of what was in that article. We have flag officers, in other words, admirals in the Navy and generals, I think, in the Army and the Air Force, all of whom should be held accountable for the dire straits that we are in with regard to the production of these missiles, because they're the ones that over the last 30 years have been in a position to change this outcome, and they haven't done it. And of course, then you have the Missile Defense Agency, which is another culprit. We spent an awful lot of money. We don't know where it went. We're not sure what we are getting for it. And what this article reveals is that we're woefully behind in the production capacity of all these missiles. They were talking about the SM-2 Block 3, which is actually an SM-6 missile now. We can produce, we think, roughly 500 to 600 a year. If you're going to do the kinds of things we are doing, if you're going to risk war, all-out war with anybody today who has any military capability at all, you need to have a production capacity that is 10 times 600. And that's just the SM series missiles. We haven't even talked about the Patriot missiles. So the whole thing is a disaster, frankly. And if we are drawn back into the war again with Iran, which I suspect we will be, then it's going to be even more acute then, because we haven't been able to make up the shortfall that we've ended up with at this point. The joke was nothing will show up for at least a year with regard to Patriot missiles and radars. And when it does, you'll end up with 17 minutes, if you're lucky, of air and missile defense. In other words, you just don't have the density of missiles that you absolutely need if you're going to provide any effective point defense, not area defense, point defense. In other words, you can't defend Ukraine, but you can defend certain points. Right now, we can't even do that. And then when you start talking about a potential conflict with Russia, I think the NATO study that came out last year is still unchanged, and that is that we can defend perhaps 5% of NATO territory against air and missile attack from Russia. That's nothing. This is all absurd. That's why the threats that we've been making are utterly foolish and empty. Look, I think we have to understand a couple of things. The Russians have always been receptive to the idea of talking to us. Or let's go back to the Biden administration. It was not the Russians who refused under any and all circumstances to speak to President Biden or his administration. Far from it. We were the ones that said, no, we will not talk to you. We are morally superior to you. You are bad. And because you are bad, we can't talk to you. This is standard leftist nonsense. President Trump came into office, and the Russians made it very clear that they're quite willing to talk to him. So this is not new by any stretch of the imagination. However, the question is, what is the purpose of the meeting? The Russians aren't fools. They know how President Trump thinks and behaves. President Trump is very short-term in his horizon. He's not looking long-term at anything. President Trump thinks in terms of, I got to get a win. Well, I got to be the guy that wins. I have to dominate this. They know that. So the real question is, why are they bothering to meet with him? We don't know what President Trump has privately said, because the Russian position is very well known. It's not going to change. Now, there are things that we can do that can accommodate them, and there are things that they could do that could accommodate us, particularly if we're willing to look at a larger strategic picture. And the Russians, if you go back to 2021, before the intervention even began in February of 2022, they sent some proposals to us. And if you look at these proposals, they are about the security architecture of Europe. And now I think the Russians would be interested in talking not only about the security architecture in Europe, but also in the Middle East and Southwest Asia, because we are busy on their southern border now, along with the Israelis, trying to create havoc and chaos in Azerbaijan and elsewhere. So I think they're interested in the larger strategic picture. What are we interested in? If you pay attention to what's happened over the last few weeks in Belarus, there is an effective unification underway between Russia proper and Belarus. Unification in the sense that Belarusian citizens, there are only 8 million of them, but they can now vote in elections that occur inside Russia. They can hold office inside Russia. In other words, effectively, Belarusian citizens are being given all the rights and privileges of Russian citizenship. In return for this, you have these Orishnik missiles that are also deployed on Belarusian soil. That means that right now, in areas that are just west of Minsk, they can launch missiles against Germany, which would be undoubtedly one of the targets given the numbers of forces we have in that country. And it would be impossible to stop because they're hypersonic and they would arrive within a few minutes. In other words, you're no longer launching from Russian territory. You're launching from Western Belarusia. So the idea that you're going to successfully overrun and take East Prussia, called Kaliningrad now, is absurd. It's not going to work out that way. Frankly speaking, I don't know of any operation in modern military history where somebody said, we're going to attack this enclave that is heavily defended and we'll take it within the space of a day or two. It's just absurd to even make such a statement. So I think it's nonsense. I think it was a bluff, frankly, and a very ill-considered bluff. And I don't know why the White House permitted it. I'm assuming that the White House and Hegseth knew it was coming. If they didn't, then one wonders why Donahue is still on active duty. President Trump sat in the Oval Office and turned to Zelensky and said to him, you have no cards to play. Right now, President Trump in Ukraine has no cards to play. If telling Donahue to threaten war against Russia is the card he thinks he has to play, then he's lost his mind. Because the thing we need to keep in mind, if you go back through all these simulations that we have had over many years, and I'm talking about in my experience in the military when I was on active duty and since then, all of the ones that specifically were involved with the Soviet Union inevitably escalated to the nuclear level. And when they did, people concluded pretty accurately that once you hit that level, it was very difficult to control anything. And the notion that you could use a tactical nuclear weapon and be sure that everyone on the other side would know this is only tactical, as Colin Powell said at the time, I don't think you can drop a nuke on someone and then tell them this is a small one and not expect a response. It's just nonsense. I think we've reached the point where James Madison, and you're a better constitutional scholar than I am, I think it was in number 10, he said that they're trying to structure power in such a way in government to compensate or at least cope with the possibility that we will not, quote unquote, always have an enlightened man at the helm. The problem is we've reached the point where I don't think we have very many enlightened men. Anybody who talks casually as this four-star did, this man Donahue, and another co-architect of the disaster in Afghanistan and its withdrawal, once you talk in those terms, you demonstrate that you've lost touch with reality. And the bad news for us, or I guess the good news for us, is that the Russians haven't, because Putin has bent over backwards to avoid these provocations leading to a nuclear exchange. That's the last thing that he wants, and he will do everything he can to avoid it. But at some point, he will lose patience if we persist along these lines. And I would not want that to happen. I think it would be better for us to now exercise some restraint and find a different way forward, negotiate intelligently. But first, if you're going to meet with the man, and this is something President Trump needs to understand, you have to have a larger strategic architecture in mind. It's not enough just to have a meeting and say, let's sort out Ukraine. No, let's sort it all out. Let's make it clear what our interests are. What are your interests? What are our interests? How do we make these harmonize? And if we can, then we can avoid future conflict. That ought to be the goal. I don't hear anybody saying that. When the first meetings were held after Trump came to office in Saudi Arabia, Secretary Rubio said something that was true, that these meetings about normalizing relations with Moscow had gone very well. He was right. They had. And that was a truthful statement. And my impression at that point from Secretary Rubio was that we were genuinely interested in a normalization of relations, quite apart from the whole issue in Ukraine. And there was a justifiable understanding in Trump's mind, at least at that point, that our relationship with Russia was far more important about any short-term goals we may have in Ukraine. That seems to have gone by the wayside. Now, where does Secretary Rubio stand? I don't know. I'm still trying to figure out why Witkoff goes to Moscow and not Secretary Rubio. The Zelensky piece is a complete mystery to me. That man and his regime are part and parcel of this whole sick MI6, CIA, Biden administration cabal that brought it into existence. Why President Trump gives a damn about any of that, why he's interested remotely, makes no sense at all. I think President Trump is interested in a meeting that makes a hero out of President Trump, where he can stand there and say, I have brought together Zelensky and Putin and we've made peace. No, it's not going to happen. The Russians are going to talk to Zelensky. They don't consider him remotely legitimate, nor should they. The question is, what does President Trump want? And he says he wants Zelensky president. And as far as I know, in this back and forth over the last several hours, the Russians have said absolutely not. And he said, Zelensky's not going to be there, then I can't meet with you, which, of course, is absurd because remember, Zelensky, along with this war in Ukraine, is not his war. Zelensky isn't necessarily his man. In fact, I'm still trying to figure out why President Trump didn't stand up, grab Zelensky by the scruff of his neck, and throw him out of the Oval Office when he was over here. I'm at a loss to figure out what's going on with President Trump, except to understand that in basic terms, he's a reality TV guy. And he is a brilliant marketer, and he wants a meeting that's going to make him look great and his administration look great. The problem is I'm not sure he's going to get what he wants because the Russians are substantive. They're looking for a real outcome. And I think it's the larger strategic architecture that is of greatest interest to them because, frankly, from the Russian standpoint, this war in Ukraine is grinding to a very slow halt. And when it ends, it's going to end on their terms anyway. So there's not a whole hell of a lot to negotiate. So that's the first thing. So that's an absolute non-starter. Secondly, Ukraine has to be demilitarized. That is whatever remains of this Ukrainian state, what we call rump Ukraine. And I'm not sure that the current Ukrainian leadership is prepared to go along with that either. I'm unconvinced that there are only two demands, though. I listened to translated, of course, comments by Yushakov this morning, who was speaking for the government. I did not get the impression that all but those two demands had been brushed aside. The administration is flailing, and I think they are ultimately failing right now. And that becomes more and more evident with each passing day. And you can go across the range of issues. There is no strategy for rounding up, evaluating, and expelling illegal aliens. There's nothing going on there. The stuff that happens is all impulse-driven. I see no evidence for a serious effort to deal with the problem on a national level. That's one example. You can go through a number of them, but I think when it comes to our overseas presence, everything is impulse-driven with President Trump. There is no strategy. I have never detected any strategy. When he took over as president, I think he's behaved as he has in the past. Now I'm in charge. Everybody has to do what I say. These are my ideas. We're going to go forward and implement them. And when he runs into opposition, he usually backs down. Then he tries something else. In other words, there is no coherent strategic framework that guides the application of military power or a national industrial policy. You see the same thing with the tariffs. Everyone who opposes me and what I want to do to Russia will have to face 100% tariffs. Then they suddenly back down and say, no, only 25% tariffs. The next question is, why tariffs at all? We're going to punish you, India, with whom we've had friendly relations for a long time, that is known to have good relations with Russia. In fact, India is a state you would turn to for help and assistance in communicating your desires, your goals, and interests to Russia. It's not a state that I would offend or alienate, but that's what we've done. And so Mr. Modi has said, thank you very much. We're not interested. Go fly a kite. The Japanese have said, we're going to buy all the oil and gas we want from Russia. It's all part of the same thing. There is no coherent strategy with attainable political military objectives. None. President Trump probably was accustomed to doing in the New York City real estate game. In other words, you arrange for a meeting on the basis of assumptions that are then suddenly overturned once you agree to the meeting. And there's no doubt that Witkoff probably said the president just wants to meet with you and wants to discuss a range of issues, and we think it's important to talk, and then ultimately leaves, and then later on it's announced we want Zelensky to be president.